this session is going to be largely focused on sort of the research and AI development track, maybe as opposed to kind of clinical operations or day-to-day operations in the health system. So I'm Travis Richardson. I'm the chief strategist at a company called Flywheel. That's a fancy way to say I spend my time out working with our customers on their data management and collaboration challenges related to research and AI, that type of thing. And what we'll do here is go down the panel here and let everyone introduce themselves. So Dr. Garrett, would you?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Garrett. I'm an assistant professor and our director of imaging informatics at UW-Madison.
Hey, everybody. I'm Brad Generu, the global lead for healthcare alliances at NVIDIA.
And I'm Matt Lundgren, chief data science officer at the Microsoft Health and Life Sciences division.
Great. Thank you, guys. And thank you all for being here for the session today. So the idea today is to really have a discussion on some of the challenges in scaling AI-related operations, but it goes, into a number of related areas that are, more akin to traditional research and some of the operational challenges there. So we're going to touch on a set of these challenges. The primary presentation will be Dr. Garrett providing an overview of some, real work, so we stay grounded in reality here. But then Brad and Matt and myself will talk a little bit about more of some of the things we're doing to support this type of work and where some of the challenges lie. So, well, okay. So just to get started, there's imaging data is a huge percentage of the overall data volume. It comes with enormous complexities. The metadata is complex. The modalities are complex. As you get into secondary use cases, for example, the challenges of identifying the relevant data, it can be enormously complicated, and that is exacerbated in multi-center studies, that sort of thing. And broadly, what we're asserting here is that if you're looking at the AI challenges, 90% or so really have more to do with data management. You all probably have a lot of smart people who can get in and build models, apply models, and so on. The challenge is really sort of how do you do it at scale, given the costs, the complexity, the compliance issues, and so on. And so those are the types of things we want to talk about. What's involved, in the spectrum of activities to support that kind of work. So in a kind of tongue-in-cheek sort of fashion here, we leveraged a slide that Dr. Garrett pulled together some time ago, but asking AI to depict the state of radiology as of 2017. And you sort of see, there's a lot of moving parts in this picture. And I don't think it's much better at this point, but we'll sort of take that as a starting point. So you have lots of, silos, lots of systems interacting, and that comes with a lot of challenges if you're trying to get a more holistic perspective on patients, for example. So if I decided, since I like John's slide, I decided to play along and say, what do you think it's going to look like in the future? So this is ChatGPT, the latest model, describing radiology in the future. I'd say the photo is perhaps somewhat fanciful, unless we all, have to leave the planet and this is somehow the one radiology center on the spacecraft. Maybe that's a little extreme, one big control center. But if you look at the things that it described on the right-hand side, it does start to tee up some of the topics that might be more relevant for discussion. So, higher resolution, newer modalities, for example, obviously AI automating analysis and helping us deal with the latencies that are involved in healthcare. Broadly, the move to multimodal, collaborative, teleradiology and other types of topics. So, okay, so this is a bit of a forward look. What we want to do is really kind of take a look at the pragmatic issues that we face today.
I like that quantum imaging and EHR integration are on the same level.
Yeah, well, there were some amusing points in that, for sure, Brad. So look, at a high level, if you look at, again, with the lens of the research enterprise and development of AI and how you scale your organization to develop and or adapt and adopt AI, there's a number of kind of high level topics that we'll touch on through the conversation today, and I'm raising these now just to kind of get you thinking about it. Maybe you'll have some specific questions in some of these areas, but at a high level, one assertion is that AI is moving really quickly. So how do you prepare your organization? So one thing is just start at the beginning. Do you have access to the data, and is the data ready? So, broadly, we see data's in silos. Um, if you look across any one institution, there's many labeling schemes for different imaging protocols. That's compounded as you get into multi-center collaborations. And then, harmonizing that, being able to, do a simple thing like, find all the T1 weighted structural images, may not be as trivial as you think. And so having that data together, organized in a secure, compliant, compute-ready sort of way is sort of one set of topics, and hopefully we'll touch on these as we go through. Broadly, the assertion is there's a move towards multimodal. You see this in the language models evolving to have vision capabilities. Why won't that apply in the healthcare context? And so increasingly what we see is customers saying, yes, I want my imaging, but I also want the related patient metadata, conditions, procedures, drugs, and related metadata, and increasingly other modalities of measurement. Broadly, the idea of digital twins, maybe Brad, this will,
Yeah.
something you could address further. So then, so what happens in a world where you're accelerating? How do you deal with this? We have a project with Dr. Garrett and team where when we started the project, it was all about building a specific model. And in the course of the project, a number of new models came out that got us questioning why we were building the model we were building in the first place. So we, more or less adopted a foundation model and transformed the project altogether. But it sort of was a great educational experience in the sense that it made us realize that getting the data in place was really the challenge there, and being able to respond quickly to change. And I'll speed this up, but the last part is, if you think about multimodality, patient-centric repositories, you've got a combination of technical and non-technical skills involved in these types of workflows, but you also have multidisciplinary, skill sets from a medical point of view, and how do you get people working well together? And that's hard enough inside of an institution, but when you're dealing with rare disease or highly stratified cohorts, you have to deal with multi-institutional collaboration, and that becomes even a bigger challenge. So those are just some high-level themes. What I'd ask you to do is to think about some of those, and in the course of Dr. Garrett's presentation and our discussion, if any of these, you'd like to dive deeper or have some thoughts on these, we'd love to address them. Okay, so really quickly, broadly what Flywheel does, and the reason I'm here, is we address these types of challenges from a software platform point of view. We started in neuroimaging in the context of reproducibility of science. There was, many of you are probably aware of the reproducibility crisis. And so broadly the concept of findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable has been developing, and we started in that context. It turns out a lot of those same challenges exist in AI. And so we've been applying our platform to help organizations scale a lot of their work around AI. So it involves collecting multimodal data, capturing the data, curating the data to a standard, enabling you to compute and then to support collaborations. And a lot of our work is about scaling. And as a result, we partner with Microsoft and NVIDIA closely to integrate their unique capabilities to help scale and address the complexities of the models. And so, we're here we can kind of address how those pieces fit together. in that context. And just a little bit more detail on how that might work. So from a Flywheel point of view, we're enabling a team to of people submitting data, reviewing data, annotating data, analyzing data to work together effectively. But that has to run in a scalable, manageable environment. So if you look at the Microsoft platform, there's excellent storage, compute, scalability, but there's also really exciting services around large language models, open source models, managing your development process with ML ops, and business intelligence, data lake infrastructures for reporting and so on. So we take advantage of those. We sit on top of those and help with that. And then from an NVIDIA point of view, I think you all know NVIDIA is pretty strong in GPUs, and so we take full advantage of those, for training and for inference. But we've also been working in the context of fully integrating some of the work NVIDIA supports in the context of imaging with the MONAI initiative. So we've fully integrated MONAI Enterprise into the Flywheel system. So you have Jupyter notebooks with MONAI Enterprise all ready to work in a secure, compliant environment. So that's the context. I won't go into any more. It's not intended to be a sales pitch, but just to kind of say this is the context, our knowledge base for the discussion. And so with that, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Dr. Garrett. To kind of take us through some reality, and then we'll come back to some higher level concepts.
Great, thanks, Travis. So what I want to do over the next couple of minutes is tell a little bit of a story about how we've been thinking about infrastructure at UW over the last couple of years. I'm going to repurpose this figure that Travis showed earlier. And then after sort of introducing our last couple of years of what we've been doing, from the infrastructure perspective, I want to dig into sort of what this has facilitated and talk about a specific set of projects that we see going from sort of the bench all the way to the bedside, and why it's important to use the right tools to do that kind of thing. So as Travis kind of alluded to, circa 2017, we had a lot of data and a lot of projects going on at UW, but there was no cohesion. There was no sort of centralized strategy for how stuff was getting managed. It looks a little bit like a joke, but there really are like stacks of DVDs, external hard drives, filing cabinets, all of that stuff floating around, with data from all sorts of different things. And at sort of the department level, we decided that it was going to be really important to start to focus and provide infrastructure to help make this something that was consistent from lab to lab. If students graduate, they move on. The next generation of students can come in and pick up a project. And also so that data can be repurposed, because if it's stored, somebody's desk collecting dust, it's never going to get used again. And so 2017, we sort of made this decision and went live with our first sort of platform centralized around this in 2018, which was going live with Flywheel. And then we also started to consolidate and deploy department level GPU resources as well, because we'd seen a similar thing, not just on the data management side, but compute. Every student's cubicle was kept warm by a hefty workstation, but the duty cycle on those types of things is just not that good. So we were fortunate to have good adoption of these platforms, and over the first couple of years, we really started to saturate some of those compute resources. Our sort of Flywheel instance got loaded up with lots of data, and we realized that there were a lot of applications to sort of expand that. And so over those first few years, we started to expand both our implementation and deployment of those platforms, and then also to add sort of additional hardware to sort of keep those pipelines working. So today we are big users of infrastructure like this. We actually have a wide variety of deployments of Flywheel. So we have an on-prem one that we use for a lot of raw data capture and things like that, but also are using these systems for conducting clinical trials. We have cloud ones for collaboration, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And the adoption has been way broader than just radiology. So users in many of our imaging-heavy departments are using these tools. One of the points that we had focused a couple of years ago on getting GPUs sort of in place, and I think one of the points I want to make on this is UW has had a great set of compute resources forever, but our challenges have historically been putting data and compute in the same room. So the Center for High Throughput Computing on campus is amazing, but you can't take clinical data and pipe it through the engineering school, at least not without raising some eyebrows. And so focusing on putting these resources where the data are was really important to us. And then also focusing on training our users to take advantage of these systems is great, because they get adopted, they get used, and then it's easier to justify buying that next system. And this has been something of a point of pride for us because right now the entire school is really trying to go in this direction, focusing on a single coherent strategy for this type of stuff in radiology. We've really been sort of leading the way here and have a chance to sort of share what we've learned and see how that gets adopted more broadly. So I think one of the take-home messages I want to sort of make is that having the right tools and the infrastructure is crucial. AI technologies are changing at an incredible pace, and if it takes you a year and a half to get sort of set up to try something, the next model's already going to be available, and your sort of experiment is going to be out of date. And so we've been able to take advantage of these in a lot of different areas, and researchers at UW have done a lot of really cool work ranging from these just a couple of examples, obviously, from many, but things to sort of respond quickly to the COVID pandemic, helping work on sort of the operational side, automating MRI scan prescriptions, working with NLP to sort of generate impressions and look at some of the state-of-the-art LLMs for things like that. And then also work in areas such as opportunistic screening. And for the next couple of slides, I'm going to really dig into that last point. So this is an example that's very near and dear to me. Opportunistic screening is not a new concept. This is basically the idea of taking advantage of clinical imaging data that's available because it's acquired. You've got the images, but it's not necessarily directly related to the clinical indication for that study. So maybe a patient comes into the emergency department with flank pain, and the purpose of their CT is to rule out having a kidney stone. But you've got a scan of their entire abdomen. You can look at things like bone density, fat burden, and so on. The word opportunistic does have maybe some negative connotations, so we like to think of it also as value added or opportuneful, serendipitous, whatever the word may be, but making the most of the data that you're acquiring. This is, I said, not a new topic, but it's something that's really in the last couple of years taken off at scale because of a couple of different reasons. So first and foremost, CT imaging is just performed at an amazingly high volume and is something that's generalizable and pretty portable from site to site. And in addition, there are now, obviously, we've all been attending SIIM for a few years, the explosion of models, just things that are available to segment things, to measure things, have really taken off. And then it helps as well that in medicine generally, there's a big emphasis on precision medicine and value add. So opportunistic screening could be used for a number of things. Certainly there's a million tools that are being used to look for things like undisclosed genetic conditions or sort of incidental cancer findings and things like that. But in this context, we're really focused more on what we would consider sort of body composition type measures. And these can be, it's projecting, I guess, reasonably well, but these can be thought of as sort of segmenting normal body tissues and then looking at sort of how, the distribution of those tissues falls. One of the nice things about this is that these are inherently sort of explainable. So if we take something like a fat, muscle, calcium, different organs or bone type segmentations, these are things that a radiologist could do if they had plenty of time when they were reading a study. They could contour an organ, they could measure things like this. And so if you make measurements or you do these types of segmentations, it's sort of inherently explainable. And this is true whether they're done in a fully automated way or even if they were done manually. And the other nice thing is that these are typically things that can be applied to a wide variety of scans. If you do decide to define a couple of measurements like this, they can be easily adjusted for things like scan protocol. But in order to sort of decide if these are useful or not, you have to be able to both build the models or test the models, which requires huge curated data sets as well as compute. And you also have to be able to do reader studies in order to understand if they're useful. So overall, the sort of workflow for tools like this looks typically something like this. You'll identify a study, decide whether or not it's eligible, and most of the time you're going to want to normalize that in some way. Once you've done that, you can look at the study and say, do I have the features present in the study period that I care about? So if I want to measure fat in the abdomen, is the abdomen part of my study, things like that. Most often after that, you're going to go through and automatically segment different organs or tissues that you may care about. So we've mentioned most of these, and then convert those into measurements. So if you have, for example, a liver, you can look at things like volume or density. Once you've defined that panel of measurements, you can use those to plug into different predictive models and look at things like risk factors for different disease types, or you can look at survival and things like that. So that's sort of the concept of opportunistic screening, and the current state of this work is there are tools like this available. They're being developed commercially, they're being built academically, but the real question is sort of what do we do next with this stuff? And at least in my perspective, the next steps for this are really to take it to the population level and start to look at how do you take these markers, correlate them in a meaningful way, with population level statistics, how do you take risk models and actually cultivate things that can be used clinically. So this is part of a study that we're excited about. We're sort of driving, and the goal here is to basically hit more than 1 million patients worth of data. We really are focused on trying to get as many patients as we can from as many different places. This means we can not only build risk models, but start to look at sort of things like what's normative, and then also hopefully be able to sort of validate that these things are robust against vendor protocols, et cetera. So in the future, the ultimate goal for this stuff is not to give a great talk at SIIM or to write a paper, but the goal is to actually find a way to use these things clinically, and ideally use them to help risk profile patients prospectively. These are things that should be available or could be available at the time of interpretation for a study. So we've given a lot of thought, even though we're not quite ready yet to sort of roll them out fully, as far as what the reporting is going to look like for this. And we've been working actively on trying to deploy these tools in practice so that we can see prospectively what those might look like. And this is just an example of a report that you might be able to share back to a patient where they get their colorful segmentation images, and then they get sort of some histograms with color coding that says, hey, your muscle and bone all looks great, but your fat, is at the sort of low end of the spectrum. Your, low percentile, your aortic calcium is high, and hopefully give something not only with a risk score, but something actionable for those patients to take home. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to Travis.
Thank you, John. There's a great deal of impressive work, and just specifically in the Oscar project. But John, your team does a lot of this type of work, and has been increasingly scaling. Maybe you could comment quickly on just the kind of where of those kind of factors I listed earlier. Which of those do you find to be the most challenging in terms of trying to scale?
I think, honestly, for us, one of the hardest things is finding ways to take the tools that we've been building and validating and distribute those to other sites. So we have done a ton of testing locally, but how do we take a toolkit that we're building and share that and collect data back from other sites? It is non-trivial to say, oh, we have software that runs here, works on this system that this GPU server, whatever. And even if you pack that stuff up in a container, it's very difficult to sort of share and get data back in a sort of uniform way. And that's something that's been, I would say, historically has been just a kind of a roadblock. You can't even do studies like this. And today, I think the tooling is much better. If something runs, at one site, using Docker containers and other sort of tooling like that makes it a lot easier to share data out. And then having, I would say, a sort of centralized repository that can help enforce, the data are getting processed and ingested in a structured way, makes that much easier.
Yeah, and maybe, Brad, that's a good opportunity to tee you up for some things. I mean, there's the obvious, scalable cluster GPUs. I think, I think that part of the problem is fairly well understood, but maybe you could elaborate on some of the tooling that NVIDIA is supporting, and maybe some of the work that directly addresses some of the points John just made about, sharing models and making them more accessible.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because it's less about like the hardware and the technology per se, but really more on how we are consuming it. How are we accessing it? How do we streamline it? When we think about the transition across all industries, I remember I've been involved in HL7 and DICOM over many years, and how we transitioned from DIMSY DICOM or HL7 V2 into the world of REST, into the world of FHIR and DICOM Web. We're seeing that transition now happen in the deep learning space, and with the development of frameworks and toolkits and SDKs and APIs, where we can make calls and really streamline how our data researchers, how our ML ops people are able to consume these services, so that we can make this reproducible, we can make this scalable, we can eliminate all of the guesswork. Back 5 years ago, 3 years ago, you'd sit down and say, okay, I'm going to grab the latest PyTorch or TensorFlow, and I'm going to pull these things together, and it's got 15 dependencies underneath that, and it's got, underneath that like another 85 or 200 dependencies. And I can't piece that together fast enough to get started. And we don't want our researchers waiting. We want them to be able to leverage these services. And so through frameworks like MONAI, the Medical Open Network for AI, an open source consortium from academia and industry from around the world put together this framework that we've integrated inside of Flywheel and connected into University of Wisconsin and the great work that they're doing to really accelerate that work, but also standardize that work so that we're not going off script. We're just doing the data science.
Right. So if to maybe paraphrase a little bit, if you're looking at Hugging Face or someplace where you're acquiring models and you're getting the weights and you can pull those down and put them in your application, that's only part of the problem. If you're acquiring DICOMs and you have certain pre-processing or other workflow steps that get that data in shape to to apply with the model, the challenge is how do you deploy the model and those pre-processing steps as a unit so that you get the expected behavior. And I know you guys, Brad at NVIDIA, through the MONI program had supported MAP and some of the other functions that do that. But maybe you could elaborate a little bit on NIMS and sort of where that's going and why you're headed in this direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you think about how deep learning frameworks started, which is, hey, is this a dog or this is a cat, and we're working with JPEGs. I mean, that proved out very quickly, very clearly how that works. Once we start thinking about voxels and radiation hitting a film plate and what does that actually mean, we needed to have a medical framework on top of the libraries that we have. And that's why MONI got its start as a framework on top of PyTorch that adds the medical extensions, that adds the knowledge of what does it mean to be working with an MRI or a CT or an ultrasound. And as we continue down this road of how do we streamline this and make MONI as an SDK, the next layer above SDK, if you think about the full stack, is the API. And as we create these services, when we think about now we want to perform inference at scale on these things, we can't stand up an entire proprietary architecture and then stand up this customized proprietary model and then connect up a DICOM standard in, DICOM standard out, and magic happens in the middle, and want to repeat that for the 14,000-ish types of use cases if you look at gamuts, and be able to scale that out for every department, every hospital in the US and around the world. And so crafting microservices, and this is where NVIDIA's come to the table with NIMS, the NVIDIA Inference Microservices, we're able to streamline that process where you pass in your DICOM study, it runs a foundational model, and there's a number out there like Vista 3D, and then you get out a segmentation. And it's simple in, simple out, simple stand up as a Docker, and portable to wherever we want to run it, whether it's locally or on Azure. So.
Right, and that's a good segue to Matt. Matt, I'm sorry, my timing's not been great here today, but it does lead to the right issue. And if you start thinking and extrapolating on the rationale that Brad mentioned for scaling services, Matt's in a unique position to see sort of what's really happening in scaling efforts, both from a services point of view, but data point of view and otherwise.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple points to touch on here. I think one is like, imagine now you really are interested in using this opportunistic screening algorithm in your health system. You're obviously going to want to validate it, right? It's incredibly good for determining certain outcomes for patients it was trained on. You need to figure out how it's going to work in an institution. Well, if they came to you, or if you had a nice setup, you would have to develop a cohort that has CT, ideally segmented and tied to these outcomes, right? That's data that's very not interoperable currently, right? So you need a platform type solution that has the ability to pull that cohort without it being a ton of manual effort. And then on top of that, you want to be able to use some of the services. Maybe you want to pre-segment, to pre-process that data so your radiologists aren't having to, do hand segmentation for all these different models. Are there ways to operationalize that? Well, I think if you think about Flywheel on top of some of these services, but then also with your data, which is easily accessible across multimodality. And then the final piece is like, okay, great, you've done that, you validated it, it's working really well, but now you want to deploy it. Okay, so where does that go, right? So what's the system to plug in there? And so that's kind of where you turn the hardware into a software problem in a couple different ways. One being, Do you need to have certain compute? What's the infrastructure you need? Well, that's something that can be serviceable in the cloud at scale, and basically an OpEx sort of expense. But the other part is sort of saying, well, how do I get this into the workflow? Most people use a reporting system like PowerScribe. Connecting that in, do I want to have that information from the radiologist? Do I want to send that information to Epic for the downstream clinicians? Do I want to send it to a research group? I think having that full pipeline is underappreciated. Again, we focus a lot about the model. We talked about this a little bit earlier on a different session, but it's actually the data work, and the pipeline development and the pre-processing and all that labeling that needs to be done and linking, that these kinds of solutions, stitched together can actually make it much, much easier. And by the way, for the next one and the next one and the next one, so you're not having to, again, redo it again and again and again.
So Matt, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on, given the scope of deployments and scenarios that you see, how do you think organizations need to evolve to keep, I'm asking about, rapid evolution. How do you deal with things changing out from under you while you're doing it? And how do you,
if I had the answer to that, I'd be.
Yeah, but I mean, what's your sense of what you have to do there to, given that change,
Well, luckily, I think we're starting from a pretty basic position now. So in other words, when we've done so-called digital transformation to date, what I've observed is that we've essentially taken what we used to do in the analog world and just simply made it digital. So the same silos, right? You basically have instead of a file room, you have a VNA, right? And you have, instead of a paper record, you now have Epic and Centricity, right? And we really haven't figured out a way to bring those things together well. Now interoperability is getting better. There are more tools and connectors, but that doesn't mean that you have the infrastructure to start making that a reality. And so I think that outside of the opportunistic screening and some of these incredible new innovations, some of the large language models coming in, you touched on vision language models coming in, I believe that we've all, I guess, collectively, the future is going to be multimodal. How do we position our data in a way that allows us to be prepared for that future? And so when I look at solutions like Flywheel, it's an additional layer on top of your traditional sort of cloud. I've got my blob storage. I've got maybe some other additional services. I actually need a little bit more sophistication there, at slightly up higher on the stack, so I can do both machine learning, inference, validation, potentially monitoring, and then finally deployment. And I can manage that life cycle through a platform like this. And that's kind of, again, how I'm seeing you preparing for the future, because again, the model is almost not the hardest part of the story, right? It's actually having the data where you need it, when you need it, the compute and the services ready, without having to, fire up 19 different systems.
So Brad, what's your take on multimodal, and how are you guys looking at supporting these initiatives? Maybe digital twins. I might bring that topic back a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure, we can bring up digital twins too. Multimodal and digital twins. That's a lot.
Yeah, there you go.
Together. Multimodal is the future, right? We cannot look at an imaging study in isolation and say, well, this is a CT study and I found this, irregardless of everything else that we know about the patient record. And we certainly know that in many, many, many use cases, radiologists and clinicians are combining not only the imaging data, but also lab work data and family history and all kinds of other things. We are absolutely seeing this brokering and coming together. When we look at large language models plus computer vision models, when we look at how they can talk to one another, I think we're just scratching the surface. A few years ago, we had took part in a very large federated learning project across, it was published in Nature Medicine, 4 continents, 20 hospitals on a COVID use case where we combined EHR data alongside chest x-rays. It was like really the first of its kind working together. But it really showed the absolute requirement, because at the end of the day, we are taking the insight that we got from the images and then transforming that into something that is a different modality for us to action upon. So we see it happening now, and it is the future, and we will see tremendous amounts more of this as we go forth.
John, maybe you could comment on sort of, how and where you're seeing this, and how you see it evolving in terms of kind of, imaging moving into more multimodal, and some of the challenges maybe related to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the challenges is a mindset change because historically clinical data have been siloed. So PACS is where the radiology and other imaging lives. Pathology may be physical slides. Some of them are scanned. Some of them are just, distilled into reports. Obviously clinical data, even things like genomics, which are a relatively modern sort of addition to medicine, most often in clinical records are a PDF scan of something that came back and there's a comprehensive panel somewhere, but it's not sitting somewhere accessible. And so starting to think prospectively about having these things live together, be part of a sort of comprehensive picture of a patient,
Right.
because it's exciting for research to think about pulling all this stuff together. But if you build a new model that depends on multimodal data sets, it has to be able to work in clinical practice too. And so you have to, I think it's a mindset change that's going to really take place over the next couple of years.
One of the things I'll point out that we see in our projects increasingly is the interest in harmonization of data. We tend to be involved in multi-center studies and increasingly uh, validated, 21 CFR Part 11, type work. And what's interesting is, coming at it from the research point of view, is that there's the desire to, well, first off, there's the desire to standardize on things like OMOP, and so on, as perhaps a way to harmonize data to support even federated learning, where you have to have a kind of a global schema. One of the interesting challenges, though, is those models, because they're so focused on traditional clinical care, they sort of ignore the depth of the imaging data, the metadata, and so on. So it knows that there's a study in existence. It doesn't know anything about the parameters or the details that might be potentially useful for the next case. And then, of course, you have tons of novel data that's, you're building a new, technique of some sort, and you're generating new classes of data, and how do those things integrate? So, one of the things we kind of pride ourselves on is having the flexibility to accommodate all of that and start to tie that together. And we're, hopeful that we can participate in various standards initiatives to tie more of that together. But the practical issues in multimodal, in terms of just like, if forget all the standards bits, just doing it, tying those different classes of data together is a pretty big challenge. Matt, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so I think there's the challenge of the common data schema, particularly when it comes to collaboration. So again, I think we're increasingly in a place where we want more data at scale, because we recognize the power of self-supervision in a lot of the work that we do. So maybe it's not the insight that comes directly from the radiology report that's interesting. That's how opportunistic screening came about, right? If you trained a model to output the report of all those CT scans, you wouldn't end up with this information, right? You would end up with what the radiologist thought. And so if we want to do self-supervised learning and we want to tie it to a variety of outcomes, there just isn't an easy way to do that. As anyone in this room knows, even understanding the timeline, which we haven't touched on too much, which is still an open challenge. How do I have the relationship between the data, but also the relationship of time? And so I think that one of the biggest advancements that I'm going to, sort of talk about at some point is the medical vision language model future, and sort of seeing where that is likely to happen. And I don't think it's going to happen in places that don't have their data in an organized way in order to take advantage of that. So give you one example. So if you think about using a large language model for a problem in healthcare, it has some capabilities off the shelf. But what you would like to do is you would like to quote unquote ground it to your institution's protocols, your institution's data. Maybe you have specific things that you would like to follow, right? So you all know the concept of using either few-shot learning or retrieval augmented generation. Well, that requires an organized, vectorized database of the information you want the model to reference. Now take that a step further into the multimodal world. Do you have your data in a place where you can actually embed it and then use it and retrieve it in a way that the model can actually take advantage of that and maybe potentially do few-shot learning? You can ask questions, you can do cohort development, image-based search, even clinical biomarker search. There's all kinds of interesting use cases that pop up, but it cannot happen in our current data infrastructure. And so if I think that a lot of the interactions of the future are going to be agent-based, large language model-based, English interaction with your data, just can't seem, you just can't make it happen without having your data in a place that can be vectorized and used.
Brad, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I'm very hopeful that we are getting very close to that. I'm very hopeful. I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago at Fire Dev Days, where I got to talk about some of the large language models and what it means for Fire. And I was so blown away by the ability of taking a set of Fire messages in a vanilla llama and just say, hey, what is this patient allergic to? Cashews? What happens if like, oh no, my patient just had some cashews. What do I do? And it's very insightful that it references the Fire object as evidence and saying, well, based on this SNOMED code, and we know that this is for allergies, this is what the outcome is. I think we are in the early days, the very early days, but we're now seeing these seeds planted, and it's incredible. I don't know where we're going to be, 3 months from now, let alone next SIIM. But it's so exciting.
Well, so one of the reasons I brought this up was that we see a lot of opportunities around, multi-center studies and trials around collecting sufficient cohorts. Like I mentioned earlier,
Yep.
highly stratified, cohorts or pediatric cohorts, those kinds of things. And NVIDIA's Flare platform for doing federated learning.
Yeah.
I know, John, you guys have done some work there, but I'm sort of extrapolating a little bit. If you start thinking about multimodal, and then you start thinking about new foundation models are going to come along, do I need to, are they going to sufficiently generalize, or am I still going to need to collaborate? Might be the first question, and then let's come back to some follow-ons. So maybe, John, what's your thought on that?
Well, I think, things like federated learning are pretty amazing tools and have already proven to be really useful for things like rare disease types. The COVID example was a great one because nobody had historical data for that. It was brand new, and in a couple of months, we were still able to scrape together an adequate data set. I think, the paradigm for building models is going to look different. You're not front-loading the data collection, but I think using the same tools for validation, so let's say call it federated validation instead of learning, is going to be equally important. And so having methods to sort of distribute whatever you're doing with the data are going to be important, I think, indefinitely.
Right. And one assertion, if you look at how federated learning works, is anybody here dealing with federated learning at this point? Okay, so one of the challenges is you have to create a global schema, which sort of gets back to the standardization point that I was making. Whether it's a standards-based global schema or not, I guess is it'd be more ideal if it was standardized. But just even getting to that point where you bring all of your data together, so your colleagues in the network, have the same structure and semantics in the data is a pretty important thing. So Matt, how do you see it? Back to the kind of point about, are foundation models going to eat collaboration, or
This has actually come up quite a bit. So like in the let's just say the pre large model days, like you would use federated learning. It was actually it was debatable whether federated learning, certainly technically it was great because you could actually move the weights around, train on a larger cohort. There's a huge advantage to that. In practice, at least from putting my academic hat on, what we found was that the amount of paperwork we still had to do to get the lawyers to approve of this, just moving the weights, we promised that the data is not being shared. It would just been easier just to share the de-identified data. But that's another story. All that being said, the push for that was just that I didn't have enough data at my institution, so I'm going to find a way to increase that data volume. Now it's sort of, I guess the way I look at it slightly differently. I would say it's going to be more of a federated validation. I think that's exactly where that technology will be incredibly useful. I don't see it as necessary. Again, I'm just putting my crystal, my wizard hat on and trying to predict the future. But I do feel like going back to the idea of being able to customize the model by having it referencing your own data kind of starts to solve some of the generalizability problems. And you've seen that with language already, right? Like I can take a large model that really understands the radiology reporting task, but I don't need to train it on all of your data to make it learn sort of how to speak in your style. It's a few shot example. Maybe it's a small number of cases. And that similar customization, I think, can potentially happen on the fly if you're, again, positioned correctly. But the validation is critical for folks like the FDA in the future. What is that new system looking like? They're talking about assurance labs. They're talking about working more closely with the centers of excellence to help them validate the solutions that they are looking to approve. That isn't going to be easy to do without, again, some sort of very easy way to move the model around on the same data schema. And I think it's going to be that federated approach seems to be the most likely. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt, for bringing up the FDA part, because that's basically addressing the elephant in the room. We are all excited about generative AI and ChatGPT and multimodal models. But at the end of the day, we need these to be installed at hospitals and clinicians use them. And I find that difficult given the lack of governance, regulations, and also I am working with RAD on the standardization development organization, IHE and HL7. And I find that there is a gap in the standardization world for addressing generative AI. And by the time that we write a profile, and it might be too long. So what do you think about that?
I think you're right in the sense that there's a gap. I don't know what will happen first, whether you will have a technology that you can use under IRB in your own institution that can start to solve some of the problems that you're interested in. Maybe they're clinical decision support, maybe they're literally workflow related. Most likely they're going to be a lot of the low-hanging fruit type tasks. Do you need to have a commercially proved solution for you to use that in your institution? For example, do you need to use a startup or a commercially available that has gone through that process? I'm not entirely sure. Just to give you a funny example, I remember when ChatGPT first came out, and I went to one of the shifts that I work in the hospital still, and there was an email that went out that said no one can access ChatGPT, right, in the hospital IT. Okay, that came out. Please do not access it. So and so they shut down. So if you try to log into it from your hospital computer, you couldn't do it. I remember I came in the morning, do pre-rounds on my pitch for the day, and every overnight resident had their phone tethered to their laptop using ChatGPT. Okay. So at some level, if the technology capability is going to be so compelling that I don't know whether it's going to need to come through the formal process or it's going to end up having to be a governance, as you're pointing out. I see this very top-down, bottom-up approach. And maybe there's going to be a shift in sort of saying, to this point about assurance labs, if you as an institution have a infrastructure and a system to review the use of these models for whatever purpose, and you are taking responsibility for that, and you're not trying to sell it to someone else, I do feel like maybe that's going to be the road that a lot of groups will be taking because of the capabilities of the technology. That's just I don't know for sure, but that's my speculation.
I might like to follow up on that and just say, as kind of a funny anecdote, I agree. I think the people who are doing research in this space, who are willing to sort of think through and try this stuff out themselves, are going to be able to help provide lots of examples that will be useful in some of the governance. But one of our sort of proudest moments in the last year related to sort of local AI deployment was not going live with a new tool, but actually the first time that we had taken a tool off of production. So it's something that we had been able to implement and get sufficient clinical feedback, because it's amazing to say, oh, we can implement these tools, we can bring them into clinical practice, but if nobody's looking at them, you may never turn them off because nobody is paying any attention. And so for people to be able to sort of iterate quickly and say, we tested this, we thought it was going to be amazing, it was not. Let's turn it off, let's move on to the next thing. And I think to have sites that are willing to sort of build and test themselves is going to be really helpful for providing that feedback and then documenting that. And that's part of the purpose of meetings like this and publications is to do that and then share your experiences, and hopefully the FDA and others are paying attention.
So that might be kind of a good segue into kind of a wrap up here. One of the things that we're seeing in some of our projects is, and Matt, you and Dr. Bruce and others referred to some of this earlier, which is the idea of spinning up a whole project every time you want to evaluate something new. And in the clinical trial space, there's this concept of an adaptive platform trial where you build a strong, well-curated, proven cohort, and then you can evaluate the next model or the endpoint against that. And it seems like, my assertion here is that I think in the world of rapidly evolving AI, I mean, everything essentially happening at once, maybe one of the most important things you can do is just prepare yourself for that, and have the infrastructure in place. But maybe you guys could each comment on sort of how you see this. Brad, we've done some work together on the concept of the AI factory,
Yeah.
and the corresponding data factory. I think it's kind of largely the same idea. Maybe I could ask you to kind of comment on how you guys think about those types of things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what is really, really important is how we measure, like the metrics of doing these things. So if I think about in the world of PACS, we would always measure with TTFI, time to first image, right? Most important metric when showing an image in a medical viewer, what's your time to first image? We need to be thinking about time to first inference, time to first train, time to first annotation. Like we need to be thinking about if we have to spin up a project, what is that time from starting to spin it up to being ready to do whatever that validation is. I've talked at length for many years at SIIM about the 555 rule for APIs, which is 5 seconds for documentation, 5 minutes to hello world, 5 hours to a working prototype. We have to be able to approach that in the realm of deep learning, generative AI, large language models, to be able to ever have a chance to adopt this at the enterprise scale that our physicians and clinicians depend on us for.
Matt, maybe you could comment on how you see the world scaling up or not, the transition to the cloud related.
Yeah, so I guess, if I'm sitting, even as a, an audience member here, I'm sort of thinking, okay, there's innovation seems to be coming. It seems to be coming quickly. I would like to take advantage of that. I would like to test it out. I'd like to see how it works in my use case. I have to be prepared for that. And again, with the current systems of on-prem siloed data, not interoperable, not close to compute in any significant way, certainly not close to where the models are going to be launched, it doesn't put you in a position for success. And so if I'm again anticipating a future state where some of these capabilities are starting to bridge into worlds that you would like to use clinically for different reasons, or frankly even for workflow reasons, the best way to do that is not to necessarily build a new large model. It's actually to prepare your compute, your infrastructure, and your data so that you can take advantage of it. Really, for me, that's the take home.
Right. And John, maybe we can close with some thoughts. You guys are making a lot of changes in your internal infrastructure to accommodate these types of things. Maybe you have some final thoughts that we could share on that.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo the last comments, Matt, from you, which is I think it's a lot of fun to build these models and see what they can do. But I think in 5 years, we're going to look back and be really grateful for the effort we're putting in to infrastructure, to plumbing. Dr. Bruce said earlier that a lot of us are plumbers, and I think that's the stuff we're going to look back on and be like, wow, I'm really glad we built that. We could test, we could fail fast, and look at what we can do today.
Great. So I think we're going to wrap it up here, but thank you all for taking the time. Thank you so much. And thank you all.
Thank you.